Bread, rice, and potatoes, these are the foods people with diabetes are almost always told to stay away from. But the reality is that these foods are core staples in cultures all over the world, and eliminating them completely just isn't realistic for most people over the long term. The good news is that you don't actually have to avoid them entirely. You can include them safely if you understand how to eat them the right way. Welcome to Diabetes Healer, and my goal is to show you how to enjoy carbohydrates without sending your blood sugar on a wild ride. We're going to focus on practical, evidence-based strategies you can start using today to blunt post-meal glucose spikes and, over time, improve insulin resistance. Before we dive in, a quick disclaimer. Even though I'm a physician, I'm not your physician. Always talk with your own doctor before making changes to your diet or medical treatment. Let's start with one of the most effective but surprisingly underutilized tools we have, resistant starch. Most common starches foods like bread, pasta, and anything made from refined flour are quickly broken down into glucose. That rapid digestion is what causes sharp rises in blood sugar. Over time, those repeated spikes worsen insulin resistance, strain the pancreas, and ultimately contribute to progression of diabetes. Resistant starch behaves very differently. Your digestive enzymes aren't very good at breaking it down. Instead of being rapidly converted into glucose, resistant starch passes through the small intestine and reaches the large intestine, where it's fermented by your gut bacteria. That fermentation produces short-chain fatty acids, such as butyrate, which have been shown to improve insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammation, and support the health of the cells lining your colon. So how do you actually increase resistant starch in your diet? One simple strategy is to take starchy foods that would normally spike your blood sugar, cook them, cool them, and then reheat them before eating. That cooling process increases the amount of resistant starch in the food. When foods like bread, pasta, or rice are cooled, part of the starch reorganizes into a form that's more resistant to digestion. This process, known as starch retrogradation, occurs when gelatinized starch molecules such as amylose realign and form crystalline structures that your small intestine has difficulty breaking down. The result is that you can still eat many of your favorite carbohydrate-rich foods just with a small preparation change and gain real metabolic benefits. In fact, multiple studies show that cooling cooked rice or potatoes to around 39 degrees Fahrenheit for 24 hours significantly boosts resistant starch levels compared to eating them freshly cooked. From a clinical standpoint, consuming rice or potatoes that have been cooled and then reheated is associated with lower post-meal glucose levels and smaller insulin spikes. So, if you're eating at home, there's no need to completely eliminate bread, rice, or potatoes. Simply cool them or even freeze them before reheating and eating them later. The texture may change slightly, but it will still be very similar, and the metabolic upside is hard to ignore. On top of that, there are plenty of foods that are naturally rich in resistant starch that you can easily incorporate into your routine. These include legumes like beans, lentils, and peas, as well as whole grains such as oats and barley. Now let's move on to the next concept, which is food pairing. Carbohydrates are rarely eaten on their own, and what you combine them with can dramatically influence your blood sugar response. Research including a meta-analysis of 154 clinical trials shows that adding protein to a carbohydrate-based meal can reduce the glucose area under the curve by as much as 50% in healthy adults. There's also strong evidence that dietary fat can soften early glucose spikes. Fat slows gastric emptying and supports insulin clearance, and over time, this can help preserve and improve pancreatic beta cell function. This is why, whenever possible, starchy or highly processed carbohydrates shouldn't be eaten alone. You may hear this referred to as avoiding naked carbs. It's also why combinations like rice with beans tend to produce a gentler glucose response than rice by itself, or why adding butter or olive oil to potatoes typically leads to a smoother blood sugar curve compared to eating plain potatoes. Another helpful strategy is adding acidic components to meals, things like vinegar, lemon juice, or lime. Fermented foods can provide similar benefits. These acids slow the breakdown of starch and reduce how quickly glucose enters the bloodstream. Vinegar, in particular, has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue and can blunt glucose spikes independently by influencing liver gluconeogenesis. I've actually made a separate video covering the benefits of apple cider vinegar and how to use it properly, and I'll link that video in the description below. Another powerful way to enhance food pairing is by changing the order in which you eat your food. Meal sequence matters. Starting a meal with bread or juice tends to cause a rapid spike in glucose. But if you begin with protein and vegetables and eat carbohydrates at the end, glucose enters the intestines more gradually, leading to slower absorption. What's interesting is that it's the exact same foods, just eaten in a different order. Yet the glucose response can look completely different. This is especially relevant when dining out, where bread or nachos often arrive before salads or entrees. In those situations, it's better to eat your salad and protein first and then move on to the bread or chips. It's a small behavioral shift, but it delivers outsized metabolic benefits. Multiple clinical studies support this. For instance, a randomized controlled crossover trial showed that individuals with type 2 diabetes who consumed protein and vegetables before carbohydrates experienced a 40% reduction in glucose area under the curve and a 31% reduction in insulin area under the curve. A more recent study from Japan used continuous glucose monitors in healthy adults and found that eating rice at the end of the meal significantly reduced postprandial glycemic excursions. Another simple intervention that can make a meaningful difference is moving your body after you eat. Research, including randomized controlled trials, shows that just a 10-minute walk immediately following a meal can lower post-meal glucose levels. It doesn't have to be walking. Light activities like tidying up the kitchen or taking the stairs can also help, but walking is the most consistently studied and the most accessible for most people. Timing matters here. The closer that movement is to the meal, the greater the benefit. Walking after eating is particularly effective because it activates the soleus muscle. The soleus runs along the back of the calf, from just below the knee to the heel, and it's a metabolic workhorse that can rapidly absorb large amounts of glucose from the bloodstream. What makes this muscle especially unique is its composition. It's made up primarily of slow-twitch muscle fibers, which are designed to contract for long periods of time without tiring out. Because of that, the muscle can continue pulling glucose out of the bloodstream and using it for energy over an extended duration before fatigue sets in. Now, moving on to another important point. You'll often hear people say that the solution is to eliminate carbohydrates entirely, and that doing so will automatically reverse diabetes or fix insulin resistance. But the problem isn't carbohydrates themselves. It's the type and structure of the carbohydrates you're eating. Not all carbs behave the same way in the body. How a carbohydrate is processed determines how rapidly it's digested and how quickly glucose enters the bloodstream. When grains are ground into very fine flour like what you see in white bread or instant oats, they're absorbed extremely fast. Whole grains and more intact. Coarser grains digest much more slowly and don't trigger the same metabolic disturbances seen with highly processed carbs. An easy way to visualize this is to think about starting a fire. Finely milled flour found in foods like white bread, breakfast cereals, pastries, and chips is like tossing sawdust into the flames. It ignites quickly and burns intensely. In contrast, steel-cut oats, intact grains, and fiber-rich carbohydrates behave more like logs on a fire. They burn slowly and steadily. For your body, that translates into smoother, more controlled glucose curves instead of abrupt spikes followed by crashes. So, similar to the approach with resistant starch, prioritize carbohydrates that come from whole foods, those that are minimally processed and naturally high in fiber. Fiber is one of the most critical carbohydrates to include, even if you're following a lower carb eating pattern. For most people, the metabolic benefits of adequate fiber intake are simply too significant to overlook. One final recommendation: avoid eating late at night. The later your meals occur, the worse your glucose handling tends to be. A large body of research shows that eating close to bedtime impairs glucose metabolism, even when the meal isn't particularly high in carbohydrates. From a physiological standpoint, Insulin sensitivity and the pancreas's ability to release insulin are regulated by circadian rhythms. As the day goes on, our capacity to process glucose declines. To make matters worse, nighttime is also when endogenous melatonin levels rise, which further suppresses insulin secretion. Less insulin circulating in the body means more glucose remains in the bloodstream. Because of this, earlier dinners are generally better. Ideally, your final meal of the day should be finished at least 3 hours before going to sleep. Alright, I hope you found this helpful. Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.